Page 10.
Page 10.
We've made it to double digits. We're almost through the first chapter.
That's a big book.
Yeah, I only read books that have 50 pages or less.
Well, name a children's book that has more than 10 pages.
I couldn't. I don't really, read at all. I never really, pick up a book and read it. My audiobook game is fairly strong, but I don't, pick up tangible hardcover books a lot. But I feel like for the instruction manual, page 10 is pretty good.
That's
double
a
digits.
little milestone for sure.
Yeah,
10.
for sure. Yep. And what are we talking about in page 10 today?
The topic is a word called burnout.
Burnout. Yeah.
And we're going to figure out what that means to us. Because a lot of people just leave it at that as far as here's a label called burnout, and they assume that you know exactly the feelings and situation they're talking about. The same thing that we talked about last episode with exercise or meditation, where it's what does it actually...
It can be a bit of a buzzword, maybe.
What does it mean? It's a label, and we saw that label thrown around and given to so many different work groups over the past few years, especially those couple years, the hardest of the pandemic ones, where complete workforces were so many news articles just saying this, doctors burnt out, nurses of course burnt out, teachers burnt out, IT people burnt out, people leaving the CRA burnt out, so it's
grocery store attendants burnt out.
Yeah, so
we're all burnt out.
So it would probably be good to figure out what that actually is and what's causing it and what it means.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe we can get a little bit into, our own experiences and what we perceive to be burnout, but maybe we'll talk about a quote-unquote textbook definition to start of what the internet and what medical professionals and research articles and stuff would say burnout is. So burnout is defined as a state of exhaustion resulting from prolonged and excessive workplace stress. So it specifically says workplace stress.
Where'd you get that?
I got that from an article that I looked up on Google Scholar. I have the notes for it somewhere if anyone is interested in seeing that article. But in a few articles that I read in just getting prepared for this page, I was trying to find how, if you went, I guess, to a psychologist or a clinical professional, I was trying to find a better definition of okay, so that's a pretty broad definition. It's not excessive stress that results from the workplace, but how would you be quote unquote diagnosed with that? I know you're not really per se diagnosed with burnout, but what types of things are they looking for? I guess
you're
if you went
self-diagnosed.
Yeah, yourself. But I mean,
if
you're actually going to a professional, how would they diagnose it, I suppose? So a lot of articles actually referenced a scale. I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but it's called the MBI scale, which is Maslow, I think. Maslow Burnout Inventory Scale. And basically it has three main parts or components to it. So the first one is emotional exhaustion. And I should actually preface this by saying that to be defined as having burnout, you actually have to have all three. You have to fall into all three of these categories. So it's not 2 of 3 or any of them. You technically have to have all three. So the 3 categories are emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and lack of professional effectiveness. So emotional exhaustion would be absenteeism, so not showing up to work, calling in sick a lot. Physical exhaustion, fatigue, feeling emotionally overextended or a lack of energy. Cynicism, would be unsuitable responses towards clients or patients or students, depending which, area you work in. Irritability, lack of optimism, reduced involvement in the workplace, and a lack of empathy. And then lack of professional effectiveness would be low productivity, low self-esteem, and low confidence in their own work. Mm-hmm. So, it's a lot of words. Like, some of those things I was just like, okay, I can, yes, I do agree that some of those things, like, all combined together resonate with what I think of when I think burnout, I guess. But maybe we can get into a little bit about, like, what we perceive burnout to be and our own experiences with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So why don't you start?
I wanted you to start. Okay. I mean, yeah, I can definitely think of times specifically over the last, 20 to 2021 era.
Which seems like a long time ago.
Seems like a really long time ago now.
As far as, dealing with information and changes and going through lows and highs and different routines, and just seems like a long time ago, I think, for a lot of people, because of all the changes in that time and just the gauntlet of information and articles and things coming at us.
Right. Absolutely.
And burnout was one of those. And it is important, when we're bringing up a topic or a page, to make sure we're all on that same page. And actually
when we're talking about burnout, we're all defining it in the same, or not even defining it in the same way, but just
we're expressing what we are thinking about,
right, when
we say those words,
right. Whether you agree or disagree, it doesn't really,
of course, you're gonna have your
matter.
own.
You're gonna have your own sort of perception of what burnout is. And I mean, I feel like I say this a lot in various episodes, but just to reiterate, we are not clinical psychologists. We're not physicians. We don't diagnose things. That's not our wheelhouse. We're just two people sitting on a couch in our living room with our microphone on yoga blocks.
Yeah, we got...
As a side note, just to take away from burnout for a second, we were away with some friends a couple weekends ago, and I had a friend be like, so take me through the setup of how you're setting up for the podcast. And I was like, literally, we put yoga blocks in between us on our couch, and a microphone rests on top of it, and we talk into it.
It's pretty bush league. It's on a voice memo. On the MacBook voice memo.
Yeah.
A Blue Yeti.
Don't give away our secrets. Okay.
It's like a $200 starter pack. So what's...
But so back to burnout. So
when you think of burnout,
when I think about burnout for myself, I mean, I feel like even pre-pandemic, it was definitely a term that got thrown around every so often just because of the field that I work in healthcare. It was quite common to hear about burnout. And sort of an off branch of burnout, which is compassion fatigue, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. And I had seen what I perceived in other people, in coworkers, to be burnout. And I guess what I perceived that as when I was reading through that MBI definition, the lack of empathy is definitely something that really resonates for me when I think about burnout or compassion fatigue. Somebody is calling you on what they perceive to be their worst day, and you as a clinician or a healthcare provider just not being able to empathize with them at all, and almost getting angry at them for seeking your assistance, or just treating them rudely or poorly,
being completely indifferent, and
being completely indifferent, where you're just I don't
really
care at all.
If you do a good job at all.
So that's definitely part of that definition that resonates with burnout for me.
That's a huge industry as far as seeing. Yeah, before the pandemic.
That was even pre-pandemic.
Healthcare burnout and stuff, right?
But so I always felt I feel like generally, or at least I try to be, I mean, maybe you should ask my coworkers how they perceive me, but I generally feel like I'm quite empathetic towards people, or at least I try to be. and that lack of empathy is definitely something that I noticed in myself in parts of the pandemic. And part of that was just overseeing too much COVID. I mean, like, how many COVID calls can you go to where everybody has like the exact same complaint while they're consuming the exact same information from like public health and the news about what to do, and like they're still calling 911, and you're going and you're giving like the same spiel to household after household after household after household after household for just like months and months, like
while having to wear basically hazmat suits.
A sperm suit, it's lovingly called.
Right, so
a painter suit. Yeah, so that, I mean, we can get into the specifics a little bit, but that's something that definitely resonates with me. And the definition, or how I would define burnout myself, is just like a lack of empathy, I think, is a huge part of it.
That's where the light starts flickering at the control panel, and you're like, okay, lack of empathy, I see that. Okay, I'm gonna have to put out that fire, or else I'm gonna lose engine number one here. And so that's like, okay, that's the first sign for you that you notice.
Yep. Again, absenteeism for sure. I'm at work a lot, so that part doesn't resonate with like me personally.
What
like,
do you
I'm
mean
not
by absenteeism?
just not showing up to work.
Not
like
showing up, okay.
Possibly because of the just lack of empathy, or like the lack of optimism, or the not wanting to be at work will call people to call in sick. So while I don't feel like I experienced that myself, I actually think I tried to overcompensate by like overworking to meet certain other needs. But absenteeism, I mean, we couldn't staff, and I mean, still look at the hospitals now. There's like massive nursing shortages. Like, people just aren't coming to work. So that's another part of the definition that definitely resonates when I think about burnout.
Yeah, well, that is when the engines have actually blown. Right? If you're not showing up and you're taking like all your sick days, and you're not coming back, and or like missing many days, like that's so far, like that is downstream, right? As far as like, okay, I'm noticing I'm not as empathetic, to all the way of not showing up. That's obviously a sign, but that's like a much later sign.
Yeah, I guess if you're thinking of it on like a spectrum, that would be it starts perhaps with the lack of empathy, or that's in like the green to yellow
like
phase,
you're
versus red is the
patience and lack of empathy. Yeah. So what's another, if you think of that as like the spectrum, or as a stream, where it's like, okay, this one is really far upstream, this one's way further down. What are some other ones that you notice?
Dread of going to work.
That leads to the absenteeism for sure. Yeah, first comes the dread.
Dread of going to work is somewhere in the middle there, but not like, I mean, okay, don't get me wrong. We all have days where we'd be like, oh, I really wish the hospital would just shut down today. I really wish it was a snow.
Has the hospital ever shut down for the day?
Or like, you know, you think of teachers, I'm sure there's been some times where they're like, come on, snow day, or something like that, right? So like, yes, I think those are normal feelings where we're all like, oh, I could really stand to like sleep in a couple hours, or just not go to work today. But the perpetual like waking up every day and being like, fuck, I really like don't want to go to work today.
Right. A dread is different than wishing your client cancels. Right? It's like, I really wish my client is dead. It's like, that's different than like, hopefully they cancel today.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, those are some things that make me think about burnout, and that, like, you know, some of those I've observed in myself, and certainly I've seen in other coworkers.
So lack of empathy, some dread, absenteeism. Have you ever had like, what's the closest you've got to actually saying you're burnt out, or you're feeling burnt out, or you are burnt out?
Yeah, oddly, I don't think in real time I've ever felt like, oh, I'm really burnt out, but it's more something I've observed after the fact. Like, certainly in getting prepared for this episode, I've like, you know, thought about this and contemplated this, and like done some soul searching on myself about like what I would want to talk about. And anytime that I've experienced burnout, I think it's more a reflective thing after the fact, where like when I'm kind of out of it, I'll look back and be like, wow, those were some unhealthy thoughts and behaviors. Good thing I made it through that one. It's not something I've overly like recognized in real time, I don't think.
Well, if I may.
You may.
We can always try to edit it out. I don't know how to do that, so we could always fiddle around with it. But just 1 year in your life, or maybe a couple, but definitely at least 1 year is the when you're in RT school. That would classify as probably the overwork burnout, where your body is reacting and having like actual physical symptoms happening from so much work and lack of sleep.
Yeah,
and stress
we don't
stuff,
need to like edit that out. Like I'm happy to talk about those things now. I think I would like to come back and talk about the different types of burnout. There's sort of 3 main ones that you have sort of like researched and brought up. One of the classifications is quote unquote overwork burnout.
Yeah.
But if I can think of two times in particular where now reflecting on it after the fact, I felt burnout. So one of them was definitely when I was in RT school. To give context to anyone on the internet that doesn't know me, certainly a lot of people that listen to this were like with me during that time and like probably also witnessed it firsthand. But so I was already a working paramedic when I decided to go back to school full-time. So I wasn't full-time in my paramedic job. I was part-time because of course we hire people part-time so we don't have to give them benefits and sick time in this province up front.
Toronto does.
So that's a whole other separate episode where we'll talk about people getting, fair vacation time and sick time and benefits.
So what was this plan labeled?
This plan was labeled my career longevity plan.
Gert's longevity plan.
And it cut about 6 years off my life. No, so this was a time where I was already working as a paramedic, quote unquote part-time, but was sort of able to pick up up to full-time hours, essentially most pays that I wanted to. And largely I was doing that when I decided to go back to school for respiratory therapy, which was a full-time program. And I should also preface this by saying we had just moved in together also, 6 months before I think I went back to school.
Yeah,
maybe 8
we moved
months.
in Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
You probably went back to school
in September. Yeah.
So probably around July, you broke the idea, or maybe it was June.
No, it was May because we were in
May. Great.
Yeah, we had only been living together.
You probably had the idea before you even moved in. You're just like, let me get his first and last month.
Yeah,
the cosign on this.
You're on to me. So I was working a lot to begin with, and decided to go back to school full time, and
you did that because.
I did that because for a few reasons. I mean, the longevity plan part of it was I was fearful if I injured myself at work or if I did suffer some, mental health issues from the job that I wasn't able to recover from.
You got burnt out.
That I wouldn't be able to, that I wanted to have another career path lined up.
Because you did mention that it's a hard profession to it's a hard profession to retire 40 years in.
Most people don't. Most people don't. So right. I was, I guess, ahead of the game a little bit in that I was thinking about that when I was 27 early on. But I just was young, and I am by nature a hard worker, and I thought I could do it. I thought I could do it all. I was doing crazy shit going to school on a Monday from 8 to 4, and then driving from school to work a night shift that night, and then then leaving my night shift to go back to school on Tuesday, and falling half asleep in class, but being there for the sake of being present, but not actually absorbing anything.
Is that when you crashed your car? Or was
this is the time I also crashed my car.
When you fell asleep. Smashed it.
We're getting way off topic from burnout.
People need to know why, who's talking, why you're an expert.
Yeah.
And
I've done it all. I've crashed my car. I've been up for 72 hours straight at work.
It was a fender bender, but well, it was, you totaled it, but nobody got hurt. Right? Their car was okay, I think.
No, their car wasn't okay.
Okay. But so that kind of stuff that would classify as overwork burnout. Right? We'll get into that in a couple minutes, but just
so to go back to your original question, though, what you were asking about times that I felt burnt out. So that was one of them, just between working too much, going to school too much, trying to make it all work, being underslept. But I was having like physical reactions where my whole body like broke out in hives, and my relationship suffered, and I was just stressed all the time, and that was burnout of a self-induced nature, where I was sort of like doing that to myself in part with good intentions and good goals, but I was just younger and dumber and didn't know what I was doing. I would even classify that as like a different type of burnout than pandemic burnout, which is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, like that 2020 to 2021 phase. Which was, I felt at the start of the pandemic almost like a sense of responsibility to be like working so much. Part of it was meeting my own needs as well. I was just like, I'm allowed out of the house if I go to work, and like I have a bunch of friends at work that I'll be allowed to hang out with if I go to work. It gives me something to do. It gives me a sense of purpose. It gives me a sense of growth and contribution.
You get paid to do it.
I get paid to do it. I'm getting actually paid extra to do it because there were bonuses and incentives and like reaching financial goals quicker and stuff, right? So
you meet all 6 of your needs
by going to
during
work.
A time when people have like very little outlets for any connection and variety and growth and contribution,
Absolutely. So there were like good intentions and like intentions of meeting needs. And, I do think that I did a good job during that time. Like it wasn't completely selfish. Like I think I went to work and I did good work generally and like helped people, but it was... at the sacrifice. I was just working like so much, like so many hours, and then kind of like I was alluding to before, going to the same types of calls and like having a lack of empathy. Pandemic aside, like one thing that I've learned as I've gotten older and more experience in working in healthcare is sometimes I find it hard to do something really awful followed by something really benign. So like for example, if I do like a car accident with 2 fatalities and they give me the option to go home from work after, I'll typically take them up on that, even if I feel mentally okay, only because I find it very challenging to go from that to then go to like a young 20-something-year-old patient who's calling for a stubbed toe. There's nothing wrong with them calling for the stubbed toe. That's their personal emergency on that particular day. You can't ever fault anybody for calling for what they perceive to be an emergency. But going from one extreme to the other, I just personally find difficult, and I know my empathy is... I just know from doing it for so long that my empathy is completely shot after going from one to the other. And I think the same thing sort of happened a lot during the pandemic and like added to that burnout of just like, going to the ICU one day and seeing like a 32-year-old die from COVID, and then like going to a house at work another day and someone being like, my nose is runny and I have COVID and
because
I'm scared and I don't know what to do. And like that, those things are okay. But going from one extreme back and forth, like a ping pong ball, is like definitely, I think for me, contributed to some burnout.
Because you finished RT school and you became an RT.
Just at the perfect time.
And that's, respiratory therapy. It's everything to do with the lungs and breathing and all things encompassing, and obviously COVID was pretty big. Business was booming, right? And
the lung factory was booming.
Yeah, lung factory was booming. So you would have calls for your paramedic job where you couldn't feel like you can do anything because you couldn't do anything other than gown up and try to talk people down.
Yeah.
And say, like, we can take you to the hospital. Everyone else there has it, and it's not a great place to be.
And there's also no cure.
There's nothing
Because
there's nothing you can
do.
Yeah. And then, like, 2 days later, you're going to the hospital, and you're taking people off of ventilators and watching them, like, die and stuff, and there's nothing that you feel you can do. And that requires a lot of self-work and self-care to deal with that shit.
Yeah. Which we'll kind of get into a little bit later, like how one deals with burnout. And I mean, you've sort of just alluded to it, but my thoughts on that are, like, prevent it before it even happens as best you can. So that was sort of my strategy.
And seeing when you start going down that stream, the burnout stream, it was like, oh, I haven't been empathetic these last, like, few calls. And come to think of it, I've been impatient, like, all week. It's like I should. And
it's trickling into home, and it's trickling into family.
Of course. And then you're into the rapids now, and now it's white water, and now it's like, oh shit, I don't know if I can get myself out of the stream. So you want to get yourself out of the stream before you get into the rapids, and that's a new analogy. That's brand spanking.
You heard it here first, folks, on page 10. And
I'll try not to rub my legs so Jenna doesn't yell at me like last episode.
We edited that out.
Oh, did we? Okay, so yeah, that's obviously a great definition of burnout for you, and an example.
For me, so I want to ask you the same question, like, how do you define burnout? And we work in such completely different fields, but also different realms, where, like, my job is very team focused, like a lot of team dynamics and, like, having to work with other people, whereas you work with other people in terms of, like, clients, but you are working independently all the time.
I don't have coworkers.
Right. So how, for yourself, because well, you've alluded to, I don't think I've ever heard you use the term burnout.
As far as you call me a dirty burnout. No, but I've never.
But, like, for yourself, have you felt that, and, like, how would you define it for yourself?
I think it would have to be me going to kind of in the past and being like, yeah, those are probably, like, feelings that you could classify as, like, some burnout and stuff, right? Like, the big one is the empathy goes down the drain, and absenteeism, of course, but again, we talked about that's more like downstream more. So, like, for me, I've overwork. No, haven't experienced that. Like, there's only so much.
Like, you're not doing, like, 84 hours a week type
of sessions. The most, like, the most training sessions and coaching sessions you can do in a day is probably, like, 7 or 8.
Right.
And, like, okay, so that's 10 hours. Like, it's not like my body's going to break down and collapse by me just talking and asking questions. It's not like I'm working out with people. It's not like life coaching is a very physically taxing job. It's mentally.
Not physically, but
it's emotionally, yes.
Yeah, emotionally.
But I'll never be like, we used, Beyonce was just in Toronto, but I know there's a couple stories of her where, like, her overwork and then just having, like, exhaustion and fatigue and, like, having to go get, like, her fluids replenished and all that kind of shit. So, like, I've never had that. It would be more so the emotional feeling like you can't make a difference, if you're if you're doing great things in people's lives and you're feeling like you have contribution and growth, then I'll never feel like emotionally drained or at least burnt out,
So your definition of burnout perhaps then, or at least part of it, would be if feeling like you can't help people.
Just showing up and running the clock out and then leaving if people don't want to help themselves. So we'll we'll get into like the three types because it'll help me explain like
Sure.
my definition.
Yeah, why don't you go through the three types?
So, again, this is just internet information, and there's probably a lot more detailed information hopefully coming soon. Just like when it comes to types of meditation or types of exercise or nutritional information, but hopefully we learn more about burnout, because all they have right now is there's three types of burnout. There's overwork, there's neglect, and there's under challenge. So
Right.
overwork, that sounds
We've talked about that.
exactly what you already mentioned.
Yeah.
You know, that's Beyonce. I
I love that you put me in the same category as Beyonce.
Well, you know.
No, but overwork
she was-
burnout is just like
Yeah.
putting in so many hours to I think overwork burnout taps in more to the definition we were talking about like physical exhaustion.
Yeah. Like you're not emotionally
Like you're not sleeping,
gone.
you're sacrificing sleep for the sake of going to work.
Yeah, you
You're-
still feel like you're doing something that you want to do and you're compelled to do it and you want to work hard,
Yeah.
but you're just breaking down.
Right.
You know, that happens with a lot of people. Neglect.
Which would be the second type of burnout.
Yes. So neglect burnout, an example would be, honestly, probably a nurse or a teacher. I mean, there's so many other professions that have probably felt like that over the last few years, but those have been the big two when it comes to like unions and strikes and like
Battling for more resources
lack of
and finances.
resources and help and stuff. So it's like you feel like you want to do good, but nobody's helping you. Nobody's putting you in a position to do it.
Well,
And-
you might be
and-
doing your personal best, but the system is failing you. The system is neglecting you. Like
You're trying to row the boat, and they give you like or you're in the army and they give you a gun with no bullets. You're like, please, like give me more help than this. They're like, sorry, like go find your bullets from somebody else who's already died.
yeah.
And or they give you an oar in your boat that is not doing any good for you. You need better tools. So
Better frameworks, better
teachers
resources.
and nurses and so many people have felt like that, where it's like we need more people, more help. We need to have like more control of our classroom and more disciplinary options or whatever. Like that can lead to feelings of my hands are tied, I can't do anything. So then you feel like you can't make a difference, and then that's just
It leads to burnout.
Of course. Yep.
Yep.
And then the third one, under challenge burnout. Under challenge burnout, that would be the one that
you
would
feel like
would
you
I
fall
would
into.
that in the past I could go through spurts of that if I don't have enough clients, if my clients that I feel like I don't have a good connection with them, they're canceling a bunch, they're not making any progress, they're not trying, I can't help them, all that kind of stuff. Like I feel, again, lack of growth, lack of contribution. My skills, I want to do more, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
That's where it would get me. So I need to make sure I'm looking at the control panel, making sure that I have some growth and contribution in my life, and I am challenging myself or trying to find things to like dedicate my life to.
Right.
I think that would be the big time. And anytime I've been like the most depressed as a teenager or early 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, like that was when I was feeling like under challenged or don't have a purpose and lack of connection, lack of contribution type of thing.
Right.
So you can see how like if you just go back to those 6 human needs, if you're just constantly monitoring those needs when it comes to your work, when it comes to your personal life, when it comes to your relationship, that's kind of the control panel right there. Like you can
They just relate to everything.
Yeah.
Could you just quickly, because I know we talk about this a little bit in most episodes, you don't have to get into the full definitions of what they all are, but could you maybe recap the 6 again?
Yes.
For everybody?
Yeah. So 6, there's 4 needs of the personality that you're going to meet no matter what. They're just your driving forces. Whether you're just hearing about them now or not, they've already been doing it your whole life or most of your life. The first 4 are certainty, variety, connection / love, and significance. And then the other 2, which you're not going to meet no matter what, you have to seek them out, and they're really the keys to like prolonged happiness and, you know, just that zest and energy for life. Those 2 are contribution and growth. And
interestingly, I think those last 2 are in the realm of like working and your job. Those are 2 that probably make people feel the most like connected and significant and all those other needs in their job.
Well, tell me, how can you be burnt out when you have a high level of contribution and growth?
Right.
The only way you could be burnt out is if you overwork yourself, like Beyonce. No, so that eliminates 2 right there.
Right. And then the overwork one, I mean, some of that can just be demands of the job. Like if you're running a massive research project, you know, you're passionate about it, you feel like you're contributing to society, you're growing.
There's time constraints.
Yeah, there's time constraints, but like really you are the governor of how much time you're putting in, barring a couple other circumstances. Like you can decide to work a 17-hour day or an 8-hour day.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's what leads to people like, well, I have to do this to get this deal done, or I need this money. I have to get this project out or else I'm going to lose my job or whatever. So sometimes I have to do this to save my business, so I need to work this many hours.
Right.
And maybe that's, I mean, it's true in their eyes and in their head.
And it may actually be true.
And no matter what, it's true, right?
Yeah.
For them in that moment, at least. So if that is true in that moment, and you are going to be leading to overwork burnout, what do you do to combat it?
Great question. So we sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier in the episode, and I think this is our mantra on most things health related, or most things we've talked about in the instruction manual so far, but I'm a big fan of proactivity. Like I like to get ahead of things before you're reacting to them, or reactionary things after the fact, I guess. And it's interesting because that is something else I tried to look up just in preparation for this episode, is reading a couple articles and like, how does one combat burnout? Like, how does one help themselves if they feel burnt out? And it's a lot of sort of fluffy, like, take some deep breaths during the day, and what was another one? I don't know. There were some good ones. Like, it's not that they're bad things. It's just, it's not teaching people, or practice mindfulness. That was another one. Practice mindfulness throughout the day. But it doesn't actually give anybody any tangible steps about how to do that, or what that looks like, or how one could start to go about doing that if they do start to feel feelings of burnout.
Or it just leads you to like, because there's so many people who write blogs about these like keywords and stuff,
right.
But really it's just like,
but what are we talking about?
See a psychotherapist or see a life coach. Like I've written blogs with like keywords being like, perhaps coaching's for you. So like, so you have to find like, okay, what's the positive information here, and what does it actually like mean?
So for me, what I tried to do, and I do think I did a good job of sort of how I like survived the burnout of the pandemic, is I really just focused on taking care of myself. And like, so that comes from, even before that comes a needs assessment of like, well, how do you take care of yourself, and like what works for you And how are you going to do that? And that's going to be individual for each person. But for me personally, I could have stood to sleep more. I definitely didn't sleep enough. And sleep is very important for just like stress regulation and well-being in general. But for me, I pretty much made sure that most, if not all days, I came home and did some sort of like physical activity. We even talked about this on day one. Like, this is how the whole idea for this podcast sort of emerged, was going for walks. Like, that was our non-negotiable every day. And a walk is a form of physical activity. So I would usually walk, you know, find connections in my partner, talk to family and friends on the phone, things like that, and then do some sort of physical activity. So I know for me personally, physical activity is just a non-negotiable most days because that boosts my mental health. So doing the physical activity before I felt like I was getting to a red zone of burnout was a way for me
just
to...
you never stopped. Yeah,
you just never stop, right?
Yeah.
And then with that also like nutrition and diet, like again, we've talked about the GI episode. Like, I have certainly had my issues, GI issues in the past. I don't like how it makes me feel. It makes me feel sluggish. It makes me feel in pain. It makes me feel less confident. It makes me feel good.
When you have the sausage intestine thing
yeah,
happening.
Exactly. When my intestines are squeezing out of the sausage casing. But so I know that I'm not going to be mentally focused and be able to deal with what I have to deal with, and it's going to stress me out more if my diet isn't in check. So I would make sure, even if it was like 11 o'clock at night, at the sacrifice of some sleep, I was, you know, meal prepping to make sure I had enough healthy food to go to work the next day. So those are just two things that worked for me to like prevent burnout. And I think for most things, prevention is generally better than reactionary. And as I said, in a lot of articles that I was reading leading up to this, I found a lot of the advice to be a little bit like fluffy, like with no tangible, actionable skills to teach people how to combat burnout.
Right.
But I did read one thing that I liked that resonated with me. And this I found very applicable to me in healthcare, although I certainly think it could be applicable to other jobs as well, is this idea of thinking about what you can and cannot control. And that sounds maybe fluffy in and of itself, but this is something that I actually think of a lot when I'm at work, and it's helped me even pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, just with dealing with calls in general and like managing stress. And so, you know, maybe it will also be applicable to like our teacher friends or our friends that work in like business sector or whatever sector you work in. But for me, so I'll give like a specific example. If I'm going to somebody that's having like acute myocardial infarction, somebody that's had acute heart attack and they end up like dying from that heart attack, say in front of me, right? It's easy. Anytime anybody suffers like a major traumatic incident or like passes away in front of you or something, as you can imagine, that's stressful or can be stressful, right? But how I've sort of like worked that around for myself is like, because I know I've done the best job that I can in taking care of myself by doing the meal prep and exercising and meditating and practicing the mindfulness and doing all those things that led me to this point, I know that I'm going to like bring my A game and do as much as I can in this exact moment to help this person. But I cannot take on all of the decisions that that person has made over the last 30, 40, 50 years that brought them here to this moment. So I don't take responsibility for their 20-year smoking history. I don't take responsibility for their poor diet choices. I don't take responsibility for their lack of exercise. Those aren't the only things. Obviously, genetics and, you know, familial history play into it as well.
And just God.
And just, you know, fate, God, whatever you want to call it. But I did like that piece of advice that I read in this article of just like, what can I control? What can I not control? I can control all the things that make me the best version of myself to bring me here to react in this moment now, but I don't have to take on all the story, the lead up, the decisions that were made that brought this person to me here. So maybe that seems dramatic, or maybe that's like more specific to healthcare, but
that's your mission statement.
Well, that could be applicable to, I don't know, like we have a lot of teacher friends or like friends that work in education, right? And that is another industry that has definitely had their fair share of struggles over the pandemic, and
Probably
the most, honestly. I've said that recently, maybe unpopular opinion, but I feel like because of the pandemic, healthcare definitely is like the sexy profession in the news that's getting a lot of, you know, like clickbait articles and a lot of time on mainstream media, you know, a lot of petitioning for funding. But I think our education system is just in some sort of situation right now where it's so underfunded. The people that work in education are absolute angels that just don't have the resources that they need to do the job the best that they can. But anyways, going back to the original point, it's like, okay, I can't control the Ford government. You know, I can't control what happened in 30 children's homes that brought them here today. There's so many things I can't control, but what I can control is how I'm taking care of myself, how I'm showing up, how I'm going to treat these children, how I'm going to make them feel, how I'm going to teach them what they're going to learn from me. And if I can keep that in mind and leave by the end of the day knowing I did my best, maybe that helps combat some burnout or prevent it.
That absolutely is a must, right? That's a must, because it's easy. I mean, you can burn out in easy times and you can burn out in hard times. Well, somebody can say they are burnt out after 1 week.
It's true.
Some people, they'll never say that they're burnt out, and they'll never feel burnt out after 25 years.
Yeah, it is interesting, eh?
And yeah, it's what you were talking about as far as like teachers and stuff. Obviously, that's like neglect burnout.
Right.
That
the system is failing them.
But you do what you can do as far as how am I showing up, and what's the mental state and the level of like patience and care and effort that I'm still putting into my job, and almost doing it like you're an aspiring musician and no one's coming to your show for the first 5 years, but you still are crushing it. And just trusting that will get you to where you want, or making some shifts in your career, and then doing that best job still. You know, a lot of people are like,
nobody's listening to your podcast for the first 10 pages.
Like, fuck it, I'm leaving the nursing profession. I'm leaving because
that's what's happening.
Yeah,
right?
But don't leave until you've for sure. You can say honestly, like, you've done your best for an extended period of time, and if the job's not for you, and you can see you're not getting any help, and it's been too long, and you've exhausted all resources, then I think you can feel comfortable with like taking a step back and leaving the profession or looking for something different.
And that, I mean, that's jobs, occupations, professions aside. I think that's for everything, right? That's for relationships,
right?
That's for everything.
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of a must, right? Or at least you got to check that box off, or else everything else it just looks like it's on shaky evidence. Because if you haven't showed up as your best self in a relationship, and you just keep moving from relationship to relationship saying you haven't met the right person, that's bullshit. Right? You have to be the best version of yourself first, and then we'll see who you attract and what that brings to you.
Right.
Same thing with a job.
Absolutely. Now, because we kind of branched out from like workplace a little bit, I have a question that I was sort of pondering. So in the actual definition of burnout, it has it right in there. It's from excessive workplace stress. Like, burnout seems to be this term that is like directly related to workplace. But can you experience burnout in other areas, like just in life?
Like,
I understand that that's the definition, but like, can you experience these same feelings, like the lack of optimism and the lack of
100%.
energy and the all these other things? Like, can burnout translate to other areas of your life? Like, I don't know, why does it just have to be workplace?
Well,
and have you ever experienced it in other places of your life?
Because there's just words and labels, and don't get hung up on them.
No, I'm just
but no, like for like people in general, it's like, okay, yes, great. Like before we started this podcast, I was like, I want to go through it like it's a deer carcass and we're wolves tearing it apart and not just leaving
he
it.
literally did say that. I was like,
yeah. I was like, okay.
Ex-nay on the carcass, eh?
So if you just go back to like, okay, well, let's get beyond the title and the word like workplace burnout or occupational burnout, and then getting to the next level, which is like the emotions that you feel and symptom. It's like, okay, well, lack of empathy, irritability, lack of optimism, like reduced drive. So do you know how many people, males especially, they're not working and they're not looking for work? People that aren't in a relationship and aren't looking for a relationship, they're not having sex either. Like, just that would probably be classified as like whatever.
Well, it's describing similar feelings and emotions that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So withdrawn and absenteeism from life, I think I see that so much these days.
Right.
Right? Even if you're physically present, just like the mentally and emotionally shut down and absenteeism there. That's pretty common. So then you could be like, well, the whole population's burnt out. In
different ways. Like, I mean,
Right.
another term I've heard before is like parental burnout, right? Like, we aren't parents, but we have lots of friends and family members that are obviously parents, and I have no doubt that everyone, loves their children unconditionally. But I can only imagine if you're going to a job where you're feeling burnt out, and then you're coming home and like the kids are crazy and you got to drive them to sports and you got to put them to bed and you got to bathe them and you got to do all this stuff, and you just, getting into this spiral of feeling like a lack of motivation to want to do extra with them, or emotional and physical fatigue.
They bleed into each other, right? Then that affects your job, and then you bring that home with you, and then you have less patience for your kids and stuff. So it's like, where did this start, right? And that's where you have to go, I think, upstream and looking at the control panel for what lights are flashing and what ones can I take care of and control. Like, going back to what you said, what can I actually control and not just think that I can control.
But like take tangible actions towards controlling.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Anyways, I just thought that was interesting because as soon as I read the definition, I was like, well, does it just have to be in the workplace, or can it trickle into other areas of your life as well?
Well, so what about when it happens in the workplace and then you take time off and it's kind of long, kind of unknown extended period of time.
Maybe you're off work on stress for a year.
Yeah, so it's like, well, what's the difference between feeling better after 1 month of time off to feeling better after 3 months to feeling better from 6 months, or from not feeling better at all about going back to the job after a year? So it's like, how come we're separated in that way, where I just need a little bit of time off and I can come back and I'm good, versus this person's been off for a year and is probably never going to come back. Right. So then you would probably look at like, what am I doing on my time off?
How am I spending my time? What am I doing with it? Who am I surrounding myself with? What am I doing? What actions am I taking to get better? Or not even get better, but decide is this the job for me and I'm just having a rough go right now, or is this just not the job for me at all?
Yes. Can you get yourself to your, at least closest to your best state, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, financially, like all those things, right? So that, because I do think there's some jobs, I know there's some jobs that I just can't do.
Oh,
and I know
lots
that,
of jobs
and
that
I know there's
people that do.
And I know there's some jobs where it's just like you're kind of, you have that personality and you're like made for it. It's like your purpose, you know. And I think teachers and nurses and like paramedics and a lot of healthcare and even like financial minds, like, yeah, there's just some jobs where it's just like, yeah, that's your wheelhouse, and you won't know if it is for sure like just the job that's not for you unless you're actually doing your best.
This just reminded me because you brought up people that work in financial jobs, but I did look up some information about jobs with the highest burnout rates. And interestingly enough, accountants are in there. I didn't get to delve too much into why, but that was one that sort of, I was just like, oh, really? That's interesting.
Well, dive into it. Why do you think?
I don't know. I haven't given it a ton of thought, to be honest.
No.
There were other things on my list. Why do you think?
I don't think I know.
Well, I can tell you for sure neither one of us know, but why do you speculate since you posed the question to me?
Well, accounting, that's obviously not my wheelhouse, and
we're not numbers people,
right? But I think that is a lot of numbers by yourself and very like monotonous and the same thing and the kind of the same schedules year after year. When it's like, okay, I'm gonna get busy for these 3 months and then I'm gonna have zero growth and zero contribution for the other 8 or 9 months.
So maybe follows into the understimulated category of burnout, or what?
And then, well, I think you probably get a shit load of work for 3 or 4 months.
Tax season.
Yeah, and that's that's overwork, and then you have the complete under challenge work for the other, whatever, 8
under challenge,
9 months.
Sorry, not understimulated.
Yeah. So you just like go from those two ends of the spectrum.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I guess I do know.
Well, a lot of the other jobs on the list, I mean, a lot of them you could probably guess. Some of them we've already talked about, but like physicians and nurses were at the top of a lot of lists. Emergency workers, whether that's fire, police, or paramedics,
police.
were
We
up there.
haven't talked about police.
Haven't talked about police, but yeah, they're up there obviously as well. Teachers are up there. Lawyers are up there on a lot of lists.
Yeah.
And this was another one that I found interesting, but retail and fast food workers have high rates of burnout. And at first I was just like, really, that's so interesting because not to say that there's not people, of course there's lots of people who do that or work in those industries full time for their whole careers, right? Like you think about managers at bars, managers at fast food restaurants, people that are just working tills for like years and years, right? It's not necessarily always like teenagers or people that are in school. But when you think about it, really, I mean, these people, or what it said in this one article that I was reading, they're constantly getting shit on, essentially. You think about people, like nothing grinds my gears more than walking into McDonald's or Tim Hortons and seeing people in front of me online just shitting all over the like 18-year-old that's at the cash. I usually feel compelled to say something.
You mean verbally assaulting?
Yeah, that's it. They get verbally assaulted.
Sometimes actually shitting. We have a friend who works at the bank, and somebody came in and threw shit around.
Yeah, that happens. But they're constantly being, berated or complained about, They're on their feet all day, so there is like a physical part of the job as well, of like running around, sweating, and lifting things, running to the back room. So there's that physical part.
You're not feeling a huge contribution as well. Unless, like, if you're working at a nice restaurant, you're serving like good food, and there's waiters, and like you can take care of people and provide hospitality.
Sure, that's a different experience. But we're talking about retail and more fast food.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, of course.
And then also they tend to be lower paying jobs. So what all of those things equate to is these people feeling undervalued, and it's the undervalue that's actually leading to high rates of burnouts in those jobs, or at least that's what this article said that I was reading, which I found interesting. That kind of gave me like a different perspective on it. And then another job that has high rates of burnout are social workers, which that is also another profession that makes sense to me of why they would experience that. But for them, and I think this would also relate to like certain types of healthcare, or really just any type of job where you're having to care for people or like listen to people, is they have high rates of compassion fatigue, which is something that I wanted to circle back to from the start. So the difference between burnout and passion fatigue. So again, burnout is this state of exhaustion from prolonged and excessive workplace stress, whereas compassion fatigue comes more from people in workforces that are dealing with victims of trauma. And trauma doesn't necessarily have to be like physical trauma. In the context of social workers, it's like, are you working for Children's Aid? Are you working for people, or are you working with people who are unemployed, right? And you're trying to help them boost their resumes, running job workshops. Are you working with people who have substance use or misuse issues? Like all different sorts of trauma. And that can lead to this idea of compassion fatigue.
Right. So you have, okay. So all those things, correct? Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about what to do.
What to do. Well, I've sort of talked a little bit. I'm very much more on the proactive side. So I think taking care of yourself, whatever that looks like, that's going to be individual for a lot of people. But I think some things that most people can agree on would be important to at least consider would be sleeping well. Sleep is important for everything. Recovery, mental clarity, mental wellness, just physical health and recovery. How you manage your stress. Go back and listen to our episode on meditation. But that can be different for everybody, whether that's like a walk in nature, getting in the float tank, going out and de-stressing with friends, right? Plus or minus alcohol. Alcohol certainly isn't like a coping mechanism. Treating
yourself as if you were your own like pet dog.
Sparky?
Okay, let's keep the dog inside for a couple of days and feed him shit. And not let him see any other dogs. Not let him play, and don't pet him. And just like show him like Clockwork Orange with his eyes, like of other dogs, like of other bad things happening to dogs on the TV, and it's like, what do you think is going to happen to that dog?
Right.
So of course, starting with taking care of the mind and body with so many of the different tools out there, and not doing a lot of the things that will put you in those like bad mental states or bad physical states. So you don't have to be some robot that doesn't check their phone 2 hours before bed or immediately waking up. Like, that's important to probably learn. Probably important to learn about exercising and some cold showers or cold tubs and helping your brain chemistry and keeping yourself like your hormones happy and your brain chemistry happy. And exercise is a big part of that. And then it goes to the food, and then it's like, okay, well, what about my 6 human needs?
How am I filling those up?
Write down, if it's...
That would be a good... That was actually going to be my next... So, sorry. That's a good idea, is maybe writing out the 6 human needs, and then writing out in columns underneath, like, how are those being met, whether in positive or negative ways. That's going to require some brutal honesty with yourself if you're meeting them in negative ways. But we did talk about, like, journaling in a previous episode, and the power of, like, writing out words so that you can see them and how your brain interprets that versus just thoughts floating around in your head. So that might actually be a really valuable exercise.
And journaling, again, that's another word that you're probably going to lose a decent amount of guys. You know,
writing out a list.
My fucking diary. It's like, no, we're going to do an exercise where you write on paper.
Right.
Okay, so what if it was that? So here's an exercise. You write down your sphere of work, and then underneath that you write down those 6 human needs, and you say, like, out of 10, like, how much certainty do I have in my job, and how am I getting it? You know, and then go to variety, and then how am I getting that? Because it doesn't matter if you're getting 10 out of 10 certainty if the way you're getting it at your job is by being a dick to everybody and having to be right and controlling other people and putting other people down. You're like, that's not good. That's not going to be good for anybody.
I would argue, though, if that is how you're getting your certainty, you're probably not in the best mental state to realize that that's how you're doing it, and you're certainly not going to want to admit that to yourself. But I do think we haven't talked about that before, but that is actually
handy.
That actually it would be a very valuable exercise that just requires some brutal honesty.
And doing that with work, going through the 6 human needs, what are they? How are you getting them? Doing that with your relationship, doing that with yourself, you know, how much variety do you have in your everyday life,
social life,
your everyday life, how much connection do you have in your life with anybody, right? Making sure you're keeping that portfolio up to date, and you don't just forget about it,
right? And
you still think BlackBerry stock is gonna be paying you nice dividends from like 25 years ago.
Pumpkin stock should peak right around January.
Right, so that's a big one. And then trying to get yourself running optimally so that you can actually see if this job isn't for you.
Right.
You know, how do you know if being a teacher isn't for you if you're not preparing for the day and you're showing up in an anxious state, or you drank like every night that week and you have a terrible headache, or whatever, like trying to make sure you're showing up in the best state you can to prevent these things from happening. But if it's already have happened and you're already on leave, what do you do when you're already on leave? And let's say you took like a 2-month absence from work. It's like, well, what do you do? Do you practice all the bad habits?
I've been fortunate. I've never had to experience that personally. So, and again, not a psychologist, not a clinician that specializes this. And so I don't know. I don't have a great answer, I suppose. I certainly think if you're in a mental state that's requiring you to be absent from work for a prolonged period of time, certainly I think one of the first steps is you should seek out some professional help. You're probably not going to be in a state, if that is the case, where you're going to be able to see things with like pristine clarity and know exactly which actions to take, even if we were to tell you some tips and tricks right here and now. So I think the first step would be seeking out a professional, and then through that, hopefully you seek out the right, and you know, sidebar, I'm a big proponent of finding a mental health professional that you like before you're in crisis. Same for physical health too, you know, like get a family doctor before you think that you have cancer, you know, like do pre-screening to prevent things before they happen. And it's no different than your mental health. Like find a psychologist or a therapist or a life coach or somebody that resonates with you, psychotherapist, healer, or chakra work, whatever works for you. It doesn't matter, but find that before you're in the red and in a state where you're trying to find somebody in a panic, because it does, like, not everybody is going to jive with you. I've seen a few therapists for various things over the years, and some of them that have been just awful. Like, I'm just like, I actually feel worse after talking to you. So find somebody that you jive with before you get to that point.
Knowing that most people aren't going to do that.
Well,
The sense of urgency is usually, it only comes, I know that because I'm, I guess you could say a life coach, whatever you want to label it as. But yes, people are typically seeking or calling 911 when it's a sense of urgency, right?
But if you can do your future self a
yes,
favor.
of course, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, so to answer your original question, if you are off for a prolonged period of time, what can you do? I mean, I think, getting a professional first is great to just help guide you.
Okay. So that's done.
And then from there, it's just, figuring out how to optimize yourself, right? Once this is something we've been hammering in the whole episode, but once you are optimized, you as your own individual person, stripped away of the job, of all your other labels and responsibilities, parent, neighbor, cousin, whatever you do professionally, if you strip away all those labels and you take a good, hard, deep look, which is hard to do, at like, who am I as a person and how am I operating? How do I move through the world? Am I happy with who I am? Are all my needs being met? I truly think that is the answer to if you can figure that out, a lot of the other things will fall in place.
Right.
Tangible steps to do those. I mean, that's what we're doing right here in the instruction manual. Every page is trying to give little tips and tricks of how you do that, because it is going to be different for everybody.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, being proactive with it, of course, and knowing that there's so many tools out there to use, but the first step, I guess, would be, can you get yourself into a more resourceful, productive state to do those things? Because more rest, like, you can be sleepy with 17 hours of sleep a day. You can have no mental energy and just no zest for life, and it doesn't matter about the amount of rest you get. Like, so sometimes it's just not, most of the time, it's not about the time taken off. It's like, what are you doing in that time?
Right. How are you spending your time to heal and recover?
Yeah. Yeah. Because I've gone through it where it's like, you feel an excuse is like you didn't have time, but you're using all that time on BS. You're using all that time on
scrolling,
on your phone and scrolling and just
around, distracting,
and so much stuff. But then it still feels like you don't have time, but really you do. So yeah, just getting yourself to a slightly better state, and then maybe going through a little bit of that.
Yeah, I really liked that human needs exercise that you brought up. I think that's a great tool, whether you are in, burnout or not, or you just need to do a little check-in and evaluation of how things are going in your job, in your family dynamics, in your life. I think that's a great, just writing it out on a piece of paper. How are things going? A little check-in.
If you're in a rocket ship and you had 6 gas tanks, and those first 4, certainty, significance, variety, and connection, were just full tanks, like shooting you to the moon, but that rocket still comes up short and burns out and runs out of fuel, because if contribution and growth are not being filled up, there's no amount that the first 4 are gonna overtake and get it through. You need those contribution and growth, or else mentally and emotionally and spiritually you will feel low on energy and like you're just running at the clock. So
burnt out.
Yes. So go look for those contribution and growth.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
All right, everybody.
All right. Be well.
Love you guys. Bye.